You are going to the facility, whether you consent or not." He stood by the dining room window, his arms rigidly crossed, a posture designed to anticipate my collapse into tears, my desperate plea on bended knees. But I offered him nothing. I did not move. I did not utter a single word. I simply watched him. A silent question echoed in my mind. Was this truly the son I had nurtured, the child I nursed with broken, tender breasts, the boy who clung to my robe during his night terrors? How does a bloodline turn so glacial? I chose not to answer, not from a lack of vocabulary, but because to open my mouth would be to let my very soul spill out. He scoffed, his annoyance palpable in the silence, and articulated his financial exhaustion. He could no longer sustain me. I was complicating his life. His wife was understandably weary. This was not a life for anyone. I was framed as a burden, an overdue account, an antiquated box cluttering the living space. He delivered this verdict without raising his voice, maintaining a deadly calmness that inflicted a deeper wound than any scream. My only thought was, what transgression of mine warranted this? But neither he nor anyone else could ever fathom the volume of silence a mother must maintain. I proceeded to the kitchen as if the conversation were merely a mundane transaction. I boiled water, I measured the grounds for coffee. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the immense, immovable strength required to suppress my tears. I sat at the table and sipped the mug slowly. From the adjacent room, I heard his voice on the phone. "The assisted living facility has an opening. I will handle all the arrangements. It will be resolved in 2 days. 2 days. That was the paltry sum of my worth. 2 days to liquidate decades of my life. I tightened my grip on the mug's rim, and the years flashed back. The good, the unbearable, the countless meals I minimized so he could have more. The nights spent vigilant against his asthma, his fears, his personal shadows, all of it. All that I was, all that I gave, reduced now to a decision made without consulting my voice. I had known this day was approaching. Not in this precise wording, perhaps, but I felt it in the way Marcus had looked at me for months, as if my mere breathing was an inconvenience. I observed it during our meals, in the sterile silence, in the abrupt closure of his bedroom door, and in the polite, calculated distance of his wife, who treated me as a guest whose visa was long expired. But that specific phrase, resolved in 2 days, that was the final concussive blow. When he returned to the kitchen, my coffee was finished. I asked him, in a low, steady voice, if he would like me to prepare dinner. He looked momentarily confused. Perhaps he had anticipated hysterics, begging, a public emotional spectacle. But I was no longer that woman. I did not offer him a single thing. I went to my room, closed the door with deliberate care, sat on my bed, and in that precise moment, in the dead center of the night that was just commencing, I made a definitive choice. If any decision was to be made about my life, I would be the architect of it. Marcus possesses no true knowledge of who I am or who I was, or the profound cost of my existence. He conveniently overlooks that I had a life before the title of mother, that I was not born frail or fatigued, that I once possessed dreams, that I danced in the torrential rain, that I loved with a reckless ferocity, that my heart was decimated and subsequently rebuilt, and that I erected everything he now seeks to dismantle. He forgets that this house is not a shared asset. I raised this house with my own hands. I dedicated 30 years as a local bakery manager, working 6 days a week, purely to finance every brick, every pane of glass, every flower in the yard. I allowed myself only 4 hours of sleep a night. I never requested anything, not even a simple thank you. But of course, memory becomes selectively impaired when convenience is the motive. I did not sleep that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, meticulously reviewing every detail of my life. The first sight of this lot when it was nothing but earth and pure hope. The day I brought newborn Marcus home, swaddled in a yellow blanket. The holidays, the laughter, the quarrels, the reconciliations, all of it stored within these walls. And now he sought to confine me to an institution, as though I were a non-compliant prisoner. I did not cry, not because the pain was absent, but because I would not bestow the gift of my tears upon him. The following morning, I rose before anyone else. I prepared breakfast as always. Marcus came downstairs with his habitual expression, that combination of haste and emotional distance. He informed me he had to depart to handle some paperwork and that we would talk later. I simply nodded. Once he left, I went to the closet, not for clothing. Not yet. I retrieved something else, a small box of dark seasoned wood that I had safeguarded for years. Inside were my critical documents, property deeds, my last will, and a small amount of savings nobody knew existed. Not a fortune, but sufficient. There were also old letters, photographs, and yellowed clippings. I sat on the bed with the box on my lap, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled. He believes I am brittle. He assumes he retains the power to dictate my future. He has no comprehension of what I have endured and what I am truly capable of. I closed the box and replaced it. My actions had to be calculated, intelligent. It was not yet time to reveal my hand, but the game had commenced, and this time I would be the one moving the pieces. That night I simulated exhaustion and retired early. From my room I listened to Marcus speaking with his wife. They were discussing the new place, that it was pleasant, that it had a garden, that it was well kept, as if describing a resort hotel, as if a mother were an object to be neatly shelved. I pulled the blanket to my neck, not for warmth, but as a shield against their contempt. The idea of leaving no longer hurt me. The pain resided in their audacious belief that they could decide it without me. They would soon learn their mistake. The coming week was destined to change everything, and this time I would pronounce the final word. I recall the precise day Marcus was born. It felt as if the sky itself acknowledged a major event. The doctor mentioned he drew a deep breath from the very first second, as if demanding the entire world with that initial cry. And I, in my blind foolishness, took that as a sign of strength, of life. I never conceived it was also a premonition. Even as a small child, Marcus was demanding. One of those who cried not from genuine hunger, but from caprice, never content with what he possessed, always fixated on what was unreachable. Yet with that unyielding blind love of a first-time mother, I labored to satisfy him. I took on extra hours at my alteration business just to afford the designer sneakers all the neighborhood children desired. I went into debt to secure him a spot at the exclusive private academy, convinced it would insulate him from poor habits and influences. I suppressed my tears and endured countless sleepless nights, all for his advancement. When his father, Robert, passed away, Marcus was 15. It was a crushing blow. But the deepest hurt was not the grief. It was the way Marcus immediately began to view me, as if I had suddenly become incompetent. As if he, with his voice cracking and his shoulders beginning to broaden, was instantly the man of the house, and I was merely an unnecessary shadow. "Don't cry so much, Mom. He had to die of something," he told me one night, while I was still clutching Robert's pillow. From that moment, our dynamic fundamentally shifted. He consulted me on nothing. He left without declaration. He spoke to me as if I were his housekeeper, his annoyance, his persistent burden. Yet I could not stop rationalizing his behavior. It's adolescence, I told myself. He's reeling from his father's death. I continued preparing his favorite dishes. I continued washing his laundry. I continued to hope that one day he would embrace me again as he did when he was a child. But that embrace never returned. Years passed. Marcus matured into a successful business executive, secured a lucrative position in the city, and moved out. I remained in this house, the structure we had built with such sacrifice, brick by painstaking brick, while Robert was alive. Every corner held a narrative, a memory, a scar. I had believed that once Marcus was established, he would return, not to reside, but to visit, to share a mug of coffee, to genuinely inquire about my well-being. But the calls grew increasingly sporadic, the texts non-existent. And when he did visit, it was always in a hurry. A curt hello, a glance at his watch, and a swift exit. But the worst pain was not the coldness. It was the way his eyes scanned the house, like someone methodically calculating what they would appropriate once the owner was deceased. One day, without preamble, he stated, "Mom, you need to seriously consider selling this place. The house is aging, and you simply can't maintain it alone." He delivered the line without making eye contact, as if the words held no capacity to hurt him. as if he did not know this house was the last tangible piece of Robert, of our history, of my own identity. I did not respond. I simply nodded silently and poured him more coffee. Following that, the pressure became relentless. Calls every week. Mom, have you contacted the notary yet? Mom, I have a friend who is keen to invest in real estate. Mom, this isn't personal. It's for your benefit. Every time I hung up the phone, I felt a piece of myself peel away, like a flower violently ripped from its stem. I clung to my routine, my gardening, my sewing, my neighborhood walks. But the shadow of his ambition had already permeated every corner of my home. Each time I opened a drawer, I felt I was preparing for my own disappearance. Until one afternoon, while tending to the rose bushes, I witnessed his arrival. His new car, his bespoke suit, his expensive cologne, and his hard, unyielding face. I've already consulted with Attorney Sterling. Mom, if you refuse to sign the documents, I will be compelled to take other actions. This house is coming to me, whether you like it or not. That was the moment something snapped. But not in me, in him. Because while he spoke, I did not cry. I did not erupt in anger. I simply gazed at him. And in that silence, I believe for the very first time, he realized that he no longer possessed power over me, that the Thelma he had deemed fragile had ceased to exist. That night, I locked myself in my room. I pulled out the meticulous ledger where I tracked every expense since Robert's death. The cost of Marcus's education, the investment in the property, the times I forewent a personal purchase to provide for him. Every figure was a festering wound, every number a calculated betrayal. And in that early hour, I understood a truth that hurt more than anything else. My son did not love me. He merely needed me to expire so he could inherit. My decision was then final. I would give him nothing. Not a wall, not a chair, not a single flower pot. The next morning, I visited the market. I walked the familiar streets with new eyes, as if every footstep was part of a nascent secret operation. I encountered Mrs. Evelyn Reed, the retired notary public. I greeted her and inquired, "Are you still available for estate work, Evelyn?" She looked at me surprised, then with deep respect. "For you, Thelma? Of course I am." That was the initiation of my preparations. I gathered documents, property titles, payment receipts. I located records, deeds, and even the old letter where Robert explicitly stated the house would always be mine, unconditionally. Weeks passed. Marcus did not call. All the better. I maintained my own silence because sometimes the greatest act of defiance is to say nothing at all. A month later, he returned with his arrogant tone, his manufactured urgency. "Mom, I've made the decision for you. You're going to the facility, whether you want to or not." That was my confirmation. It wasn't just greed, it was contempt. And that was the ultimate breaking point. I came home that afternoon with a tight constriction in my throat, as if I had swallowed a rough stone that could never be expelled. There was a shift in the air, a density that had been growing, like a fog that no longer bothered to disguise itself. It was contempt, Marcus's contempt, my own son's. I felt it in the plates he left uncleared on the table, in the way his voice sharpened whenever he addressed me, in his refusal to meet my eye, as if I were a mere prop in the house. And that night was different. He did not yell. He did not throw objects. He did not directly insult me. It was far worse. He simply sat opposite me in the dining room while I completed serving dinner. He watched me in a silence that froze my blood. "I have already finalized things with Mr. Dawson," he said abruptly, slicing his meat without looking up. "Everything is settled. This house will be in my name, and you are going to the facility, whether you want to or not." I offered no response. Not a sigh, not a single tear. I took my napkin and placed it on my lap with the same measured, slow movements as always. I felt something shrink within me, as if my soul were shriveling in momentary fear. But I remained silent because, in that very silence, I was also making a profound decision. I did not sleep that night. I paced the hallway from one end to the other. Shadows stretched along the walls, as if the house itself was keeping vigil. How did we arrive here? I wondered. When did my son become capable of viewing his mother as an intrusive nuisance? But questions were now a luxury I couldn't afford. The next day, I began an activity I hadn't pursued in years: writing. I retrieved an old notebook and began to compile dates, names, and facts, as if my life were a file that required intense scrutiny. I recalled the original deed to the house, the document secured in a locked box deep within my closet. And I remembered something vital. I had not yet signed anything. That transfer had not legally occurred. The house was still legally mine. If he believed I would surrender it like an old rag, he did not know me well enough. I started small. I sold some antique silverware inherited from my mother, then a few pieces of jewelry that had been stored away for decades. All in silence, all without arousing suspicion. Marcus remained convinced I was the submissive woman who laundered his clothes and served his breakfast without complaint. No, not anymore. The day before his scheduled visit with the attorney, I overheard him speaking on the patio phone. He was unaware I was concealed behind the curtain, listening. Yes, it's all sorted. The old lady doesn't say a word. She just cooks and wanders around like a ghost. No problem. We'll sign next week and I can begin the renovations. I'm going to gut that entire kitchen. I did not cry. But that phrase, that moniker, the old lady, that is what he called me. Not mom, not mother, not the woman who gave him life. Just the old lady. And in that precise instant, I knew there was absolutely no more time to waste. I had to protect the small fraction of myself that remained, the part he was determined to destroy. The following morning, I rose early and went to the bank. I opened a new account under an entirely different name. I initiated precautions I had never imagined necessary. I changed passwords, saved document copies in disparate locations, and reread the house deed line by line as if it were a tragic novel. And in that rereading, I discovered a detail I had forgotten, a clause that permitted me to nullify any change if I could prove coercion or abuse. I guarded that page as if it were a pure gold ingot. The humiliations persisted. Marcus was tireless. Every day he devised a new method to make me feel small. Sometimes he simply ignored my existence. Other times he would enter with grocery bags and drop them forcefully onto the table as if I were his minimum wage employee. No words, only commands, only cutting glares. One night, when the atmospheric tension was so thick you could physically chew it, I prepared his favorite meal, smothered pork chops and rice, exactly as I had when he was a boy. I thought, in my lingering naivety, that the taste might trigger a memory, a happy moment, a shared laugh, an embrace from the days when his hands were small and sought refuge in my skirt. But no. He took a single spoonful, tasted it, and remarked with sheer disdain, "This is bland." Just like you. I froze, not because of the cruelty of the phrase, but because there was no anger left in his tone. It was a state of total, absolute indifference, as if I had already ceased to exist. That was my final realization. I could not endure this alone any longer. I thought of one person, the only one who always spoke to me with kindness when we crossed paths at the market, even though it had been years since we had a real conversation. Serena Hayes, the neighbor down the street who cared for her sick mother until her last breath, the one who had offered me help more than once when she saw me struggling with heavy bags. We were not intimate, but there was a light in her that made me believe some goodness still existed in this broken world. I went to find her. I walked to her house with my heart caught in my throat. When she opened the door, her hair pulled back, her apron covered in flour, I simply said, "I need to talk, and I have nowhere else to go." She let me inside without a single question. I sat in her kitchen, which smelled invitingly of freshly baked bread, and I allowed everything to spill out, every word, every invisible blow, every night of suffocating silence, every gesture of contempt. Serena listened without a single interruption. She offered no easy platitudes. When I finally finished, she simply took my hand and said something that still resonates in my memory. "You are not alone, and you do not have to donate your life to someone who does not value it." That day, something fundamentally shifted within me. I returned home a different woman. I no longer walked with a stoop or shoulders slumped in defeat. I felt for the first time in an age that I possessed a plan, a real one, my own. And Marcus noticed. He looked at me with narrowed eyes, as if he suspected a hidden agenda, but he remained silent, merely frowning and returning to his phone. I, on the other hand, smiled, for I knew his time was running out, and mine was just beginning. Serena honored her word. She did not merely listen once. She began visiting me frequently, quietly, as if aware that any whisper in this house could detonate. She brought homemade bread. Sometimes she simply sat with me on the patio, watching the leaves descend. Slowly, she became a constant presence, a companionship that required very few words. Her mere being there was a profound relief amidst so much shadow. One afternoon, while we prepared some potent black coffee, she looked at me with those tranquil eyes and said something that startled me. "Thelma, if you decide to leave, I will help you go anywhere. You don't need to tell me when. Just tell me that you are going to do it." I did not respond immediately. I watched the steam ascend from the pot as if it held all my thoughts. But inside, something was igniting. For the first time, I felt I could not only escape, but start anew. That night, in my room, I opened the drawer containing my critical papers. I pulled out the deed to the house and stared at it for a long time. My name was there in bold black ink, Thelma Price. It was mine. Everything was still in my legal possession. I had not conceded anything, not yet, and I would not. I commenced gathering everything required for a clean disappearance: documents, the small sums of cash I had withdrawn slowly to avoid suspicion, my birth certificate, bank books, an old gold chain from my grandmother. I concealed everything in an empty cookie tin, stored under a false bottom in the dresser. No one would ever know. In the interim, I played my role perfectly. I continued to set the table as usual, cooking without passion, but without error. Marcus seemed preoccupied, more consumed by his calls, his investment schemes, the renovations he was already meticulously planning for a house that was not yet his. But I started to notice a disturbing detail. He was checking up on me. Sometimes he would enter my room without warning, using the flimsy pretexts of searching for a pen or his keys. He would linger a few seconds longer than necessary, as if inspecting the premises. His eyes swept over the drawers, the shelves. He was searching for proof. He didn't know what exactly, but I felt watched. This necessitated greater caution. I began to memorize the exact placement of all my belongings, taking photos with my old phone in case anything was moved. Every action had to be measured, every gesture, every word. It was then that Serena presented a possibility I had not considered. My cousin lives near Asheville, North Carolina. She has a small, quiet place. She asks very few questions. Could you begin there? I remained silent. The name echoed in my mind like a distant sound. Asheville. It wasn't the place that mattered. It was the promise. A new atmosphere. A new Thelma. And how would I get there? I asked softly. I will drive you, she said without hesitation. We concluded that the departure had to be precise, swift, with absolutely no margin for error. The plan crystallized. One Friday morning, while Marcus was at his weekly meeting with Attorney Sterling, I would slip out the back door with a single suitcase and meet Serena on the corner. She would have everything prepared: the car, the route, the silence. I committed myself to one objective: to leave the house in impeccable order before my exit. He would find the house intact, clean, an empty inheritance. Just the furniture and the walls, nothing more. Because I had already begun selling the valuable items piece by piece. Not the large, obvious ones, but the ones he would never notice until he desperately needed them. I sold the porcelain dinnerware set inherited from my mother, a collection of heirloom black folk art, an oil painting that had hung in the hallway for 2 decades. Each sale was a small goodbye, a fragment of history I released with a mixture of sadness and immense liberation. I kept the money in envelopes tucked inside a double lining in my purse. If all proceeded as planned, I would have sufficient funds to live for a substantial time without dependency, without asking for anything. But the days passed, and Marcus became increasingly nervous. One afternoon he asked, "Have you been to the bank recently?" I denied it without altering my expression. "Why? I don't know. I feel something strange is happening. I need to ensure you're not signing anything behind my back." The irony was staggering. He, the architect of the house-snatching scheme, was concerned about my suspicious actions. "I have nothing to sign, Marcus. You know I no longer handle those affairs," I lied seamlessly. His gaze pierced me, but he did not press the issue. Then, 2 days before my scheduled departure, the unexpected happened. A small accident. I was returning the last papers to my hidden box when a receipt fluttered to the floor. Marcus walked in at that precise moment and saw it before I could retrieve it. He grabbed it. It was a receipt for the sale of an antique figurine. It did not bear my name, but it had a delivery address. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's old. I found it in a box." "It's nothing," I replied, my heart hammering against my ribs. He watched me for seconds that felt like eternity. Then he placed the paper on the table and left without another word. But he did not sleep at home that night. Serena called me as soon as she found out. "We're moving it up. We cannot risk this now." And so it was. The day before the planned departure, I packed my belongings, a single, manageable suitcase. I left a letter on the dining room table, weighted down by a vase. It was not a loving farewell. It was a declaration of sovereignty. I explained that the house was not his, that I had signed nothing, that he no longer had my permission or my silence. "Everything you destroyed in this house," I wrote, "cannot be repaired with new walls. And now that I am leaving, you will finally understand a mother's presence is worth more than any money." That was my final sentence. I did not sign it with love. I simply inscribed my name, Thelma Price. When Serena arrived for me, I did not shed a tear. I closed the door with a determined finality. I did not look back. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds, yet I felt something akin to the sun warming my skin. Freedom. We drove away in her car without the distraction of music. The journey would be long, but for the first time in years, I was completely unconcerned about the destination. I only knew that I was not returning, and that the monster I had raised would now be forced to learn how to exist without me. The car moved slowly along the back road, flanked by tall trees, swaying gently in the wind. Serena kept both hands steady on the wheel, and I gazed out the window as if life were finally passing by for the first time. The house was behind me. Marcus was behind me. And behind me was that shattered version of myself that had endured far too much. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence is a space that does not require filling. Mine was crowded with images, with phrases I never spoke, with cries I had suppressed for years. Serena's, I believe, was the silence of one who understood the sheer weight of what was being abandoned. But as we drove toward the horizon, back in the house I had left intact like an empty shell, Marcus was returning to his golden prison. He parked his car in the driveway, noticing nothing unusual. He walked inside, speaking on the phone with that sharp, calculating voice he used to finalize deals that were never what they seemed. He crossed the living room, blind to the vase and the letter beneath it. He poured himself a glass of water, kicked his shoes into a corner, and slumped into the armchair. It was then that it struck him. The silence. A different quality of silence. Not the familiar one, not the habitual quiet of a mother keeping to herself. This was a deeper, heavier void, an echoing absence. He rose and moved through the house. He called my name 2, 3 times. Nothing. He went upstairs and found the bedroom empty. Not ransacked, not messy, just empty, as if the very soul had departed. He descended slowly, and passing the table, he finally saw the letter. He read it standing, his brow furrowed, initially with incomprehension, then with immediate rage, then disbelief, and finally, with that look men have when they never imagined something would ever truly leave them. He ripped the paper, threw it on the floor, and violently kicked the vase, shattering it against the wall. "You have no right." He screamed at the empty space, at the woman who was no longer there to absorb his fury. He checked the closet. He threw open the drawers and discovered the missing items: jewelry, documents, the folders containing the house deed, the envelopes of cash. Everything. For the first time in his adult life, he felt fear. Not the fear of property loss, but the raw terror of having lost control. He called my phone once, twice, 20 times, always the same detached message. "The number you have dialed is not available." He called his contacts. Nobody knew or nobody would betray me. He even attempted to call Serena, whom he had profoundly underestimated. She did not answer, and that is when the real breakdown commenced. For days, he haunted the house like a furious ghost. He mentally rewrote the letter with rage. He convinced himself I would return. that this was a mere tantrum, that I was too old to begin again, that I could not possibly live without him. But every night spent alone, every coffee he had to prepare for himself, every unironed shirt he found, a bothersome certainty settled into his skin. This time, I was not coming back. It was then that he started investigating. He visited the bank, reviewed transactions, and saw that money was missing, small sums withdrawn over many weeks. He had never noticed. He had always assumed I was clumsy. He never once thought I could conceal anything from him. He went to Attorney Dawson and demanded to know if there were any legal movements on the property. Dawson, visibly uncomfortable, informed him that I had requested a certified copy of the deed. Nothing more. No signatures, no donations, nothing. So, it's still in her name? He asked, his voice strained. Yes, everything still legally belongs to your mother. And if I attempt to sell it without her signature... Dawson raised an eyebrow pointedly. You cannot. Legally, you possess no right whatsoever. That was the final confirmation. Marcus understood that he hadn't merely lost me. He had utterly underestimated me. He began interrogating neighbors, asking about friends, but no one offered a single word. He even went to Serena's house and knocked, but no one answered. He knew she had been gone for a few days, too. This only intensified his rage. He began drinking, not violently or dramatically. He did it in silence, seated in front of the television, which was tuned to channels he wasn't watching. Bottles emptied without a sound. Food possessed no flavor. Days passed without purpose. And in that abyss, he began to look at the house with completely different eyes. At first, it had been his trophy, his early inheritance. Now it was a prison, with walls that relentlessly reminded him that he did not know how to wash clothes, how to cook, or how to sleep without someone else managing the volume of the television. One morning, he woke up and found the living room covered in a fine layer of dust. He realized the refrigerator was empty, the coffee was gone, the bathroom smelled stale, and then he finally broke into tears. Not a childish cry, not a loud wail. It was a low, almost shameful sob, a whimper between clenched teeth, because for the first time, he felt what he never imagined feeling: abandonment. And that was the true revenge. Not the papers, not the money, not the letter, but the absence. Mine. The mother who was always present, even when he did not deserve her company. The one who endured contempt disguised as jokes, orders disguised as advice, coldness disguised as care. I had not abandoned the house. I had abandoned the weight. I had released my own executioner, and that fact disarmed him entirely, because no matter how much he screamed, how angry he became, how much he sought retribution, he could not force me to return. And every night, as he locked up with the lights off and the television murmuring to itself, he understood a little more the final sentence of my letter. A mother's presence is worth more than any money. And that presence was no longer his. We arrived at the town's entrance as the sky began to bleed a deep orange. It was not a tourist destination or a place of great charm. It was quiet, silent, just enough for a broken woman like me to learn to breathe again. Serena turned off the car and looked at me with that familiar expression of tenderness and firmness. She said nothing. She allowed me to take my time. I stepped out slowly. My legs were shaking, not from weakness, but because each step was a deliberate decision. Each step was an act of rebellion against years of emotional subjugation. I crossed the threshold of the small, single-story house we had rented. It held no luxuries, but more importantly, it held no ghosts. That was precisely what I needed. The air inside smelled of old wood and fresh cleaning. The windows were open, allowing in the soft murmur of the wind. I stepped onto the floor, like someone finally reaching solid ground after a long, terrifying shipwreck. I sat in the single dining room chair and let out a low, unexpected, almost hysterical laugh. Serena poured me a glass of water. She sat across from me. "You're here," she said, as if it were an Olympic achievement. "Yes," I replied. "I'm here." I did not sleep that night, not because I was uncomfortable, but because my body did not know what to do with such profound silence. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no passive-aggressive messages, no judgmental stares. Just the night and me, and that was my first free night of insomnia. The following days were clumsy, Learning to live without fear requires time. The first few times I ventured to the market, I walked around viewing everyone as a potential, disguised danger. It was difficult to smile, not because I lacked the desire, but because I had forgotten how to do it from the inside out. Serena was patient. She accompanied me, gave me space. Sometimes she cooked for me without asking. Other times, she simply read in silence while I stared at the wall, unsure of what to think. Slowly, the house began to smell like morning coffee. The plants she brought from the nursery started to bloom. A neighbor, Martha, knocked on the door one day to offer freshly baked bread. I smiled awkwardly, unsure if this act was dangerous or not. But Serena gently squeezed my arm, reminding me that I had climbed out of the well. One afternoon, while watering the pots on the patio, I realized I was humming a song. I didn't recognize the melody, but it was unquestionably mine. My mind was finally singing.